The chill of the small rented apartment seeped through Lucia's thin sweater, a damp cold that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the silence. It was a silence broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of her 10-year-old son, Michael, asleep in the other room. Her own stomach ached with a hollow, gnawing hunger she had grown accustomed to over the past weeks, a gnawing that was almost a physical sound in the oppressive quiet. On the rickety kitchen table, a single piece of paper lay stark white against the dark wood. The eviction notice. The words blurred as she stared at it, the black ink feeling like a brand on her soul. She felt her throat tighten, a familiar prelude to tears she no longer had the energy to shed. She opened the small tin box next to it. Inside, 2 $20 bills and a $10 $50. $50 between them and the street. The air tasted of dust and defeat. It was the taste of rock bottom. She closed her eyes, the darkness behind her lids a welcome, if temporary, escape. 6 months. It felt like a lifetime, and an instant all at once since the phone call that had shattered her world. She could still smell the antiseptic sharpness of the hospital, a scent that now clung to her memories of her husband, Roberto, the clatter of machinery, the shouts, a fall. They had told her it was an accident, a workplace accident. The paltry settlement they had offered was meant to be a balm, a financial cushion. Instead, it had been a whirlwind of paper, swallowed whole by the gaping maw of medical bills and the cost of a funeral she insisted be dignified. It was the last dignity she could give him. Now the money was a ghost, just like him. It had vanished, leaving behind only the echo of what it could have been. She ran a hand over the empty space beside her on the worn-out mattress, a cold spot where warmth used to be. A profound loneliness washed over her, so intense it was like drowning in an icy sea. His laughter was a phantom sound she chased in her dreams. Michael. Her heart clenched into a tight, painful knot whenever she looked at him. He was trying so hard to be brave, to not complain about the meager meals of rice and sometimes a single egg. But she saw it. She saw the new thinness in his face, the dark circles under his eyes that mirrored her own. She saw the way his gaze would linger on the windows of bakeries when they walked home from school. The guilt was a physical sickness, rising in her throat like bile. Tonight, as he slept, a single tear escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek, landing silently on her chapped hand. He was the reason she got out of bed. He was the reason she hadn't shattered into a million pieces. And he was the reason she felt like such an absolute failure. Every pang of his hunger was a stab in her own heart. She felt the crushing weight of her responsibility, a mountain she was trying to hold up with trembling, exhausted arms. She was failing him. The thought was a relentless, cruel whisper in the back of her mind. Her gaze fell upon the corner of the living room, where it stood like a silent monument to a different life. Her sewing machine, an old, sturdy Singer, its black cast-iron body gleaming dully in the faint light from the street lamp outside. She walked over to it, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. She could smell the faint, familiar scent of machine oil and the ghosts of 1,000 different fabrics. This machine wasn't just a tool, it was an extension of herself. It was the whirring hum that had been the soundtrack to Michael's childhood, the pedal beneath her foot, a steady rhythm in their lives. It was her skill, her trade, her pride. Her hands, calloused and capable, had created countless garments on it. Now, those same hands were empty. The thought of selling it, of letting a stranger haul it away for a pittance, made a wave of physical nausea rise up her throat. She ran her fingers over the gold lettering, tracing the name. It felt like saying goodbye to the last piece of who she used to be. The choice was no choice at all. It was a sentence. She walked back to the table and picked up the $50, the paper bills feeling flimsy and useless in her hand. $50 might last a week, maybe, if they ate little, if nothing else went wrong. The stark white of the eviction notice seemed to glow with a malevolent energy, a final countdown. Her stomach rumbled again, a low, miserable complaint. It was the machine, her history, and her future. Or it was food. It was her son's next meal. She looked toward the dark doorway of Michael's room, and the decision solidified in her heart like a block of ice. Her chest felt hollow, a vast, empty cavern where hope used to live. The machine's hum would be replaced by a desperate silence. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Tomorrow, she would walk into the pawn shop. Tomorrow, She would sell her soul for another 7 days. The silence in the apartment pressed in on her, heavy and absolute, the sound of utter surrender. The day after the decision was a blur of motion, a frantic scramble before the sun was fully up. Then a sharp, metallic clatter from the mail slot broke the morning's heavy silence. It wasn't the soft fold of a junk mail flyer. It was the hard, authoritative sound of an official envelope hitting the floorboards. Lucia stared at it. Her heart, which had been beating a slow, tired rhythm of defeat, suddenly kicked into a frantic, panicked pace. It was too soon for another notice. Her hands trembled as she bent to pick it up. The paper was thick, creamy, and expensive feeling. It wasn't a bill. The return address was from a law office in a town she'd never heard of, Black Creek, Appalachia. With a growing sense of unreality, she tore it open. The formal legal language was dense, but a few words leaped out, seeming to glow on the page. Deceased, great-uncle, sole heir, property. The words didn't make sense. They were fragments of a different life, a story she had no part in. She felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the floor had tilted beneath her feet. The letter explained, in cold, precise terms, that her late husband, Roberto, was the last living relative of a man named Ansel and had inherited his only asset, an old watermill. A watermill. The words conjured a fantastical image in Lucia's mind, a picture painted by a desperation so profound it bordered on delusion. She saw a sturdy, charming stone building nestled by a sparkling creek, a great wooden wheel turning slowly, peacefully. She pictured a real home, a roof that was theirs, a place where the words eviction notice could never haunt them again. Hope, a feeling she thought had been extinguished forever, flared up inside her chest. It was a painful, fragile thing, a tiny flame flickering in a hurricane of doubt. A sob escaped her lips, a sound that was half grief, half disbelieving joy. A sign. It had to be a sign. The gnawing hunger in her stomach was momentarily forgotten, replaced by this wild, terrifying and utterly consuming spark of possibility. She felt Roberto's presence in that moment, a whisper from beyond the grave, offering one last lifeline. The $50 on the table suddenly looked different. It was no longer a week's worth of meager survival. It was a choice, a terrifying all-or-nothing gamble. Her rational mind screamed at the foolishness of it, traveling to a strange town, to a place she'd never seen, based on a single letter. It was insane. But what was the alternative? Selling her sewing machine, her soul, for another 7 days in this cold apartment before the landlord changed the locks. The image of Michael's thin face, his trusting eyes, flashed in her mind. He deserved more than a slow slide into homelessness. He deserved a chance, and this, as insane as it seemed, was the only one they had. Her decision solidified, swift and absolute. She would take the money, buy a bus ticket and go. She would leap. Her hands, no longer trembling, folded the letter with a new, firm resolve. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not just with fear, but with the terrifying, calm, exhilarating thrill of a final, desperate bet. This was not surrender. This was a fight. Packing was a swift and sorrowful affair. There was so little to take. A few changes of clothes, Roberto's worn photograph, Michael's favorite book. Each item placed into the single-thatched, battered suitcase was a memory of a life that was now over. The small apartment, which had felt like a prison for months, now held a strange, sad nostalgia. She ran her hand along the cool metal of her sewing machine. A silent promise whispered in the dusty air, "I'll be back for you." She looked at Michael, who was watching her with wide, uncertain eyes, and she forced a smile she didn't feel. "We're going on an adventure," she said, her voice brighter than she felt. The click of the apartment door shutting behind them was deafeningly final. It was the sound of a chapter closing, a life being left behind. As they walked down the familiar, cracked pavement for the last time, Lucia clutched the bus tickets in her pocket, the thin paper feeling like the most important document in the world. They were her passport to a new life, or to ruin. The bus station was an assault on the senses, a chaotic symphony of human desperation. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes and greasy food, punctuated by the garbled, echoing voice of an announcer, calling out destinations that all sounded like they were at the edge of the world. Lucia held Michael's hand so tightly her knuckles were white, navigating the swirling currents of people rushing past. She felt small and invisible, a tiny boat cast into a vast, indifferent ocean. The price of the tickets had been $42. Her heart had seized as she watched the bills disappear into the cashier's hand. $8. That was all that was left between them, and total destitution. $8 and a single, unread letter. The number became a mantra of terror in her mind, a frantic drumbeat against the fragile hope she was trying to nurture. As they found their seats on the bus, the worn vinyl cool against her skin, she stared out the window, praying she hadn't just made the biggest mistake of her life. The hours on the bus bled into one another, a monotonous blur of humming tires on asphalt and the endless and shifting landscape outside the grimy window. Lucia watched the dense, towering buildings of the city she knew recede, replaced by sprawling suburbs, then flat plains, and finally, the gently rising, unfamiliar green of the Appalachian foothills. The world was growing quieter, emptier. Michael had fallen asleep against her arm, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that was the only comfort she had. She watched him sleep, a fierce, protective love swelling in her chest. This was for him. This had to work. Yet, with every mile that carried them further from everything she knew, a cold tendril of dread began to snake its way around her heart. The lawyer's letter, which had felt like a divine proclamation in her apartment, now seemed flimsy and absurd in the harsh light of day. What if it was a mistake? What if there was nothing there? The questions repeated, a low, ominous hum beneath the drone of the engine, growing louder with each passing mile. The bus pulled over at a lonely crossroads, marked by nothing more than a rusty, bullet-scarred stop sign. "Black Creek Crossing," the driver yelled, not even turning his head. Mills about a mile down that gravel road. With a hiss of air brakes and a belch of diesel smoke, the bus was gone, leaving Lucia and Michael standing in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something wild. The wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the trees that lined the road, a lonely, mournful sound. Her city-tuned ears strained for the sound of traffic, of sirens, of people, but heard nothing. There was only the wind and the frantic thumping of her own heart. A deep, primal fear began to prickle at her skin. They were completely, terrifyingly alone. This wasn't the peaceful quiet she had imagined. It was an empty, watchful silence that made her feel like an intruder. The gravel road was rough and uneven, the sharp stones digging into the thin soles of her shoes with every step. The suitcase, which had felt so light leaving the apartment, now seemed to be filled with lead, its wheels catching on rocks and ruts. Michael, exhausted from the long journey, trudged beside her, his small hand locked in hers. "Are we there yet?" he asked, his voice a small, weary plea. Lucia's own legs ached, but it was a different ache that consumed her, the ache of growing dread. Through a break in the dense, overgrown trees, she caught her first glimpse of the mill, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a charming stone building. It was a jagged, dark silhouette against the bleak, grey sky, a broken tooth on the horizon. The romantic image she had so carefully constructed in her mind shattered instantly. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach, making it difficult to breathe. This was wrong. It was all wrong. As they got closer, the full, devastating reality of the place crashed down upon her. This was not a neglected home. It was a corpse of a building. The stone walls were slick with a green film of moss, weeping dark stains from a century of neglect. A huge section of the slate roof had collapsed entirely, leaving a gaping wound that exposed the rotting timbers within like the ribs of a skeleton. The great wooden water wheel, the centerpiece of her hopeful daydreams, was a splintered, broken wreck, half buried in the mud of a creek bed that was nothing more than a dry, dusty scar on the land. The wind, no longer a whisper, howled through the empty, gaping window frames, a sound of pure desolation. Every shred of hope that had propelled her on this journey drained out of her, leaving behind an icy, hollow void. She felt Michael's hand tremble in hers, and she knew he felt it too. This was not a beginning, it was an end. The smell reached them long before they got to the door, a physical assault on her senses. It was the thick, suffocating stench of decay, of deep, pervasive rot that seemed to emanate from the very stones. It was a complex and nauseating perfume of wet, crumbling plaster, of sour, stagnant water, and the pungent, acrid tang of years of animal droppings. Lucia instinctively raised a hand to cover her nose, a wave of bile rising in her throat. This was not the smell of an old house waiting for life. It was the smell of a tomb. It was the smell of death, the death of wood, of stone, and of her last, desperate dream. The revulsion was so strong it made her shudder, a violent, involuntary tremor that ran through her entire body. She had imagined the scent of old wood and baking bread. The reality was the stench of utter ruin and abandonment. The isolation was absolute. Standing before the crumbling facade, Lucia scanned the horizon in every direction. There was nothing, no other houses, no winding roads, no distant lights, just the dense, dark woods pressing in on all sides, and the vast, indifferent grey sky above. The feeling of being completely cut off from the world was a crushing weight, far more terrifying than the poverty she had fled. In the city, even at her most destitute, she was surrounded by the hum of life. There were streets, people, the possibility of help. Here there was only a profound and terrible emptiness. If she screamed, the trees would be the only ones to hear. If Michael got sick, there would be no one to call. A jolt of pure terror, cold and sharp, shot through her. This wasn't just an abandoned place, it was a forgotten one, a place where you could simply vanish. Michael, who had been eerily quiet, finally broke the silence. His voice was a small, trembling whisper that was nearly swallowed by the wind. "I'm scared, Mommy. I want to go home." Home. The word was a dagger in Lucia's heart. Their home was an empty apartment with a new lock on the door. She knelt, her knees protesting as they hit the damp, cold ground cows, and pulled him into a hug. She tried to murmur reassuring words. "It's okay, mi amor. It just needs some cleaning." But the lie felt like ash in her mouth. Her own voice sounded thin and alien in the vast emptiness. She could feel the bone-deep chill of the place seeping through her thin coat, a dampness that felt like it was sinking directly into her soul. The guilt was a physical sickness. She had promised him an adventure, a new home. She had led him to this grave. With a deep, shuddering breath, she forced herself to her feet and pushed on the massive wooden door. It resisted, then swung inward with a long, agonizing groan of rusted hinges that echoed like a cry of pain through the cavernous space within. The darkness that greeted them was almost total, a thick, palpable blackness that the weak afternoon light could not penetrate. As her eyes slowly adjusted, the full horror of the interior revealed itself, and her stomach dropped. The air was frigid and even more foul than outside, thick with the smell of mold and the dust of ages. Cobwebs as thick as cotton hung from the high ceilings and draped over every surface like macabre decorations, swaying in the drafts that whistled through the broken windows. The floor was a treacherous landscape of rubble, fallen beams and slick, dark patches of dampness. This wasn't a house, it was a hazard. In the center of the gloom, a monstrous shape loomed. The mill's machinery, a colossal, intricate tangle of gears, shafts, and two massive grinding stones, stood like a silent, iron beast. It was covered in a thick, unbroken blanket of rust and grime, a testament to decades of stillness and decay. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming, a dead giant entombed in its own collapsing shell. Any fleeting, insane thought she might have had of fixing this, of bringing it back to life, was instantly obliterated. It would take a fortune she would never have an army of workers. The machine was not a tool waiting to be used. It was a monument to failure, a final, irrefutable symbol of her own disastrous miscalculation. It was a rusty testament to the fact that she had led them to a place from which there was no return. Lucia stood frozen in the center of the ruin, the cold seeping up from the stone floor, Michael's small, trembling hand in hers. The realization settled over her, not with a crash but with a slow, sinking certainty that was far worse. The eviction notice hadn't been rock bottom. The hunger, the fear, the sale of her pride, none of it was rock bottom. This cold, rotting, isolated tomb, hundreds of miles from anyone, with $8 and a terrified child. This was the bottom of the world. The tears she had fought back for so long finally broke free. Not in loud sobs, but in silent and hot streams that traced paths through the grime on her cheeks. She had gambled everything on a ghost's promise, and she had lost. There was no hope here. There was only the cold, the rot, and the crushing, absolute certainty that she had failed in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The first few days were a waking nightmare, a blur of cold and hunger. Lucia found a corner in the massive main room, sheltered from the worst of the wind by an intact section of wall E, and made a nest for Michael out of their spare clothes and her own coat. Sleep was a shallow, fitful thing, punctuated by the mournful howl of the wind through the broken windows and the frantic beating of her own heart. A profound despair had settled deep in her bones, a coldness that had nothing to do with the frigid Appalachian air. It was the crushing certainty of having made a fatal mistake. But then she would look at Michael's sleeping face, his small form curled up against the biting cold, and a different instinct would take over. It was a primal, maternal fire that burned through the fog of her hopelessness. She had to do something, anything. Action was the only antidote to the paralysis of fear, the only way to keep from simply lying down on the cold stone floor and surrendering completely to the ruin that surrounded them. On the third morning, she decided to clean. The idea was absurd. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. The scale of the filth and decay was monumental, a task for a demolition crew, not a lone, half-starved woman with a single battered suitcase. But it wasn't about restoration, it was about rebellion. It was a fight against the suffocating presence of death and neglect that permeated the very air she breathed. Finding a splintered piece of wood for a dustpan and using a stiff, discarded broom she found hooked on a nail, she began to sweep. The sound was lonely and pathetic, a dry, scraping whisper against the immense, cavernous silence of the mill. Scraps of rotted wood, clumps of dirt, dried leaves, and the tiny, brittle skeletons of mice and insects were pushed into a growing pile. Her arms ached, her back screamed in protest, but she kept going, pouring all her fear and rage into the simple, repetitive motion. This small act of order was her declaration of war against the chaos. The dust was a living entity. It rose in thick, choking clouds with every sweep of the broom, filling her lungs and coating her tongue with a gritty, ancient taste. It smelled of decay and time itself. Lucia's stomach, already clenched with hunger, churned with nausea from the foul air and the sheer physical exertion. The cold from the stone floor seeped through the thin soles of her shoes, a relentless chill that traveled up her legs and settled deep within her. She was acutely aware of the futility of her efforts. For every square foot she cleared, 100 more remained, buried under layers of grime and debris. Yet, she couldn't stop. With each methodical push of the broom, she was carving out a tiny pocket of livable space, a small island of relative cleanliness in an ocean of filth. It was a space for Michael, a space where he wouldn't have to sleep directly on the dirt. It was a mother's desperate, illogical attempt to impose a semblance of care and control on a world that had spiraled into madness. Michael, with the resilient and sometimes maddening adaptability of a child, had found his own way to cope. While Lucia waged her war on the dirt, he explored the safer areas of the mill, his initial fear giving way to a cautious curiosity. The cavernous space, with its monstrous, silent machinery and strange echoes, became his own personal, desolate kingdom. He treated the piles of rubble like mountains to be conquered, and the dark corners like mysterious caves. He hummed to himself, the small, thin sound, a fragile counterpoint to the howling wind. He was trying to build a new world for himself within the ruins of the old one, a testament to the uncrushable spirit of childhood. Lucia watched him out of the corner of her eye, her heart a painful mix of pride and profound sorrow. He deserved a sunlit park with a playground, not this mausoleum of rust and shadows. He deserved laughter, not the lonely echo of his own voice in a collapsing building. It steeled her resolve. In his explorations, Michael found a treasure. It was a small, perfectly smooth grey stone, worn round and flat by a river that had long since vanished. It fit perfectly in the palm of his small hand, its coolness a comforting, solid presence. This simple rock became his companion, his toy, his one possession in this new, frightening world. He spent an hour near the base of the colossal grinding mechanism, the dead heart of the mill. He wasn't allowed to climb on the treacherous, each rusty machine itself, but the floor around it was a landscape of its own. He imagined the stone was a car, driving it over the uneven flagstones, making quiet vroom noises that were immediately swallowed by the vastness of the room. He sent it skittering across the floor, chasing after it with a focus that momentarily erased the hunger and the cold. For a few precious moments, he was just a boy playing with a rock, and the world was simple again, a universe contained in his game. Then, disaster struck in the small world of his game. The smooth stone, his prized possession, slipped from his fingers during a particularly enthusiastic vroom. It didn't just drop. It landed with a sharp clatter on the iron base of the machinery, and San, with a momentum all its own, rolled away. It disappeared into a dark crevice where the huge machine met the stone floor. A tiny, metallic rattling sound traced its path into the guts of the rusted beast before fading into absolute silence. "Mommy," his voice, sharp with distress, cut through the quiet. "I lost it. My rock, it went in the machine." Lucia paused her sweeping, a wave of irritation washing over her, immediately followed by a familiar pang of guilt. It was just a rock, but to him, in this place, it was everything. She sighed, the sound a cloud of white in the cold air, and put down her broom. The mountain of filth could wait. Her son's small heartbreak was a more immediate and important problem to solve. She knelt beside him on the grimy, freezing floor, the dampness instantly soaking through the knees of her thin pants. Her body ached with a deep, weary cold. "Show me where," she said, her voice softer now. Michael pointed a trembling finger at the dark gap at the base of the monolithic iron structure. "It went in there. I heard it fall." Lucia peered into the darkness, but could see nothing but layers of rust and ancient cobwebs. The space was too small for her to fit her hand in properly. She felt around blindly, her fingers brushing against the cold, rough, flaking texture of the rusted metal. The smell of oxidation was strong, a dry, metallic tang in the air. She could feel the immense, dead weight of the machine looming over her. It felt like probing the jaws of a dead leviathan. Her fingers, scraped and raw from cleaning, met only more corrosion and sharp edges. The stone was lost. She was about to tell him so, when her fingertips brushed against something else. It was a gear, nestled low on the machine's foundation, half hidden by a tangle of what looked like a snapped iron belt, but it was wrong. Her fingers, which had grown accustomed to the uniform texture of brittle, crumbling rust, registered a distinct difference. This gear felt smoother. While every other inch of the machine was covered in a thick, orange-brown crust, this specific cog felt almost clean to the touch, the rust a mere film rather than a thick shell. Her exploring fingers could clearly define the individual teeth, their edges still relatively sharp, beneath a thin layer of grime. A flicker of curiosity, the first she had felt in days, ignited in the cold pit of her stomach. It was a tiny, illogical detail in a vast tableau of uniform decay. Why this single gear? Why was it different from the thousands of other rusted components on this metal monster? It made no sense. It was an anomaly, a question mark in a place of definitive statements. Driven by this sudden, inexplicable impulse, she tried to turn it. She wrapped her cold, stiff fingers around the gear and pulled. It didn't budge. It was frozen solid, locked in place by decades of disuse and damp. Her rational mind told her to stop, that it was a pointless waste of energy. But the anomaly, the sheer wrongness of it, wouldn't let her go. It was a loose thread, and she felt a desperate, primal need to pull on it. She repositioned herself, planting her feet on the slick floor and bracing her shoulder against the cold iron frame of the machine. The metal was shockingly cold, a brutal contrast to the faint warmth of her own body. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the frigid air burning her lungs, and pushed with all the strength she possessed. All her frustration, her despair, her anger at their situation, she channeled it all into this one, singular, pointless effort, her muscles screaming in protest. For a moment, nothing happened. There was only the sound of her own strained grunt, swallowed by the cavernous room. And then, something gave, not smoothly, but with a deep, groaning shriek of metal scraping against metal, a sound of protest from a long, silent mechanism. It was a horrifying, ear-splitting noise that made Michael jump back with a cry of alarm. Lucia ignored him, her focus absolute. She pushed harder. Her teeth gritted, a bead of sweat tracing a path through the grime on her temple. The gear moved, inch by painful inch. Then, with a suddenness that made her stumble forward, the resistance vanished. A loud, definitive click echoed through the mill. It wasn't a sound of breaking or crumbling. It was a clean, sharp, mechanical sound, a sound of release, a sound of something unlocking, a jolt of pure adrenaline, a potent cocktail of fear and wild excitement, shot through her veins. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She scrambled back, her breathing ragged, and stared at the base of the machine. Her eyes scanned the spot where she had been pushing. There, a thin, dark line, a perfect rectangle, had appeared on the surface of the heavy, cast-iron foundation. It was a seam that hadn't been there moments before. A section of the metal, about the size of a large book, had shifted inward by a fraction of an inch, its edges breaking free from the surrounding rust. Her breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful gasp. This was no trick of the light. This was not a random break. This was intentional. This was a door. This entire monstrous machine, this symbol of their failure and isolation, was hiding something. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, chasing away the cold, the hunger, and the despair, replacing them with a frantic, consuming curiosity. What was this? Who had built it? And why had they hidden it so well? Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from a dizzying mix of terror and anticipation. This felt dangerous, forbidden. She looked around the empty, decaying mill, the shadows in the corners suddenly seeming deeper, more watchful. She was no longer just a desperate mother cleaning a ruin. She was an intruder, stumbling upon a secret that had been deliberately buried. Using her already broken fingernails, she hooked them into the narrow gap and pulled. The metal was heavy and resisted, sealed shut by time. She grunted, pulling with a desperate strength, the rough edge of the iron biting into her fingertips. It didn't move. She needed leverage. She looked around wildly, and her eyes landed on the discarded broom. Snapping the rotted wood of the handle, she jammed the splintered end into the crack and pried. The wood groaned. Then, with a final sharp crack of protest from the hinge, the panel swung slowly inward, revealing a cavity. The opening was a patch of perfect, impenetrable blackness within the rusted iron frame. A wave of different air washed over her face as the panel opened. It was not the damp, mouldy stench of the mill. It was a different scent, ancient and dry. It was the faint, unmistakable smell of old leather and paper, an aroma that spoke of enclosed in protected spaces, of things carefully preserved against the ravages of time. It was the smell of a forgotten secret. A chill, completely unrelated to the cold, traveled down Lucia's spine. Her heart was pounding a frantic, uneven rhythm in her ears. She felt Michael press against her back, his small body tense with fear and wonder. "What is it, Mommy?" he whispered, his voice awed. "I don't know," she whispered back, her own voice hoarse. She honestly didn't know if this was a deliverance or a curse, a treasure chest or a Pandora's box. She only knew that she had to find out. Taking another shaky breath to steel her nerves, Lucia reached her hand into the dark, unknown space. The air inside was still and dry. Her fingers, expecting the cold, rough texture of iron, instead met something soft, cool, and slightly yielding. It was not metal. It was fabric or something like it. Her mind raced. What could possibly be hidden inside the foundation of a 2-ton grinding machine? She probed deeper, her fingers tracing the outlines of the objects within. They felt like small, heavy sacks, and something else, something hard and rectangular underneath them. A box, a book. The tactile sensation was so at odds with the setting, the soft texture against the backdrop of hard, decaying industry, that it felt surreal. She gripped the first object, her fingers closing around a lumpy, coarse-textured bag, and began to pull it out from its hiding place and into the dim, grey light of the dying afternoon. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold it. The object was a small, unassuming canvas sack, darkened with age, its mouth cinched shut with a brittle leather thong. It was far heavier than it looked, its weight solid and promising in her palm. It felt full of small, hard-chan, irregular shapes, like a bag of gravel. For a wild moment, she thought it might just be that, a bag of strange rocks, a forgotten game piece from the miller's child. but the care with which it was hidden, the elaborate mechanical lock, the leather-lined compartment, it all screamed of value, of importance. With clumsy, fumbling fingers, she worked at the hardened leather knot. It was stiff and refused to give. Impatient, she picked at it with a broken nail until the ancient thong snapped. Her heart pounded in her throat. She tilted the bag over her other hand, which was grimy and scraped, and held her breath. The contents spilled out. They were not rocks. They landed in her palm with a quiet, heavy density. They were dull, greasy-looking stones of varying sizes, most no bigger than her thumbnail. They looked like dirty pieces of glass. But as she shifted her hand, a stray beam of weak sunlight lanced through a hole in the roof and struck them. In that instant, they came alive. Cold, internal fires ignited within the stones, throwing off dazzling, sharp flashes of blue and white light. The flashes were so brilliant, so pure that they seemed to burn against the gloom of the mill. They were raw, uncut diamonds, dozens of them. They felt cool and impossibly heavy against her skin, their value so immense, so reality-shattering, that her mind refused to process it. She stared, breathless, at the impossible fortune lying in her dirty hand. This couldn't be real. It was a fever dream, a hallucination brought on by starvation and despair, a cruel joke played by a crumbling building. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she had to place a hand on the cold iron of the machine to steady herself. Her vision swam. Diamonds. Here, in this forgotten, rotting place, the sheer, staggering absurdity of it was overwhelming. She looked from the raw, glittering stones in her palm to Michael's wide, astonished eyes, and then back to the dark cavity. With a trembling hand, she reached back inside. Her fingers found another sack, and another, and two more after that. She pulled them all out, lining them up on the dusty floor. 5 of them in total. 5 heavy canvas sacks, each one promising the same impossible treasure as the first. It was a fortune. Not just enough to fix the roof or buy food, it was enough to change everything. It was a new life. It was safety. It was a future for Michael. A hysterical sound, half sob, half laugh, escaped her lips. The sound was alien and shocking in the dead silence of the mill. As the initial shock began to recede, replaced by a trembling, fragile sense of reality, she noticed there was one more item left in the secret compartment. It lay flat at the very bottom of the leather-lined space, where it had been cushioned by the sacks of diamonds. It was a book, not a printed book, but a journal, its cover made of dark, cracked leather that was flaking at the corners. It was about the size of her hand, thick with pages that had yellowed to the color of old ivory. She reached in and lifted it out. It was surprisingly light compared to the sacks, but it felt heavier in a different way. It felt freighted with the weight of time, with the unspoken story of this place. The air around it smelled faintly of dust and secrets, a dry, papery scent that was a world away from the mill's pervasive dampness. This, she knew with a sudden, chilling certainty, was even more important than the diamonds. She ran a trembling finger over the worn leather cover. It was smooth and cool to the touch. There was no title, no name, no markings of any kind. It was utterly anonymous. She looked at the sacks of impossible wealth on the floor, and then at the silent, unassuming book in her hands. The diamonds were the what. This journal, she felt in her very soul, was the why. It was the key, the explanation for the madness she had just unearthed. Why hide a fortune in diamonds inside a grinding machine in the middle of nowhere? Who had done this? And why had they never come back for it? The questions swirled in her mind, a dizzying vortex of possibilities. Her initial euphoria over the wealth was already being tempered by a deep, unsettling sense of mystery and a growing premonition of danger. Treasure like this was never without a story, and those stories were seldom happy ones. She knew, without knowing how, that she was holding the story in her hands. With Michael watching her in wide-eyed silence, Lucia sank to the floor, her back against the cold iron of the machine, and opened the journal. The paper was brittle, and she was careful not to tear it. The inside cover was blank, but on the first page there was writing. The script was a cramped, spidery scrawl, written in an old-fashioned style with a pen that had long since run dry. The ink had faded from black to a rusty brown, but it was still perfectly legible. At the top of the page, a date was carefully written, June 14th, 1973. Below it, the first entry began. He came again today, the devil himself, smelling of coal smoke and money. He says the work is almost done. The words sent a fresh chill down Lucia's spine, colder than any draft in the mill. This wasn't just a ledger or a record of accounts. This was a confession. This was a man's final testament. The story had begun to unspool. She looked at the first sack of diamonds, then back at the journal. The connection was immediate and terrifying. The devil, the work. This wasn't a family inheritance. This was something dark, something secret. She carefully turned another fragile page. The entries were sporadic, sometimes dated days or weeks apart. They spoke of fear, of threats, of being trapped. They spoke of a powerful man, a coal baron, and of illegal operations, of men who were paid in cash and then disappeared. She read a line that made her blood run cold. They are not stones. They are the price of souls, and he has made me his banker. The weight of the diamonds in her lap suddenly felt different. They were no longer a promise of a bright future. They felt tainted. They felt heavy with the sins of the past, with the story of the tormented man who had written these words and hidden them away from the world. A man named Ansel. The name was there, signed at the end of a particularly desperate entry. Ansel, the great-uncle, Roberto's forgotten relative. He wasn't just the owner of a mill. He was a keeper of secrets, a reluctant accomplice in a crime that had been buried for half a century. Lucia felt a strange, ghostly connection to him, a man she had never met, whose legacy had just exploded into her life. He had been trapped here, just as she was. He had been terrified in this very room. The thought made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The mill was no longer just a ruin, it was a crime scene, and she, by an impossible twist of fate, had just found the evidence. The diamonds weren't a gift, they were a burden, a dangerous, glittering burden that tied her directly to the crimes of the past and the ghost of the man who had hidden them here. The mystery was no longer a curiosity, it had become her own. Lucia closed the journal, her mind reeling. The initial dizzying shock of finding a fortune had been completely eclipsed by a new, more powerful emotion, a burning, all-consuming need to know the rest of the story. Who was the coal baron? What happened to the men who disappeared? What was Ansel's role in all of this? The journal held the answers. The diamonds were the motive, but the journal was the weapon. She had stumbled out of a story of poverty and into a story of conspiracy. The cold of the mill floor seemed to recede, chased away by the heat of the secret she had just unearthed. She looked at Michael, whose face was a mask of confusion and awe. She had to protect him. But how? What did you do when you found a treasure that was also evidence of a terrible crime? The silence of the mill was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghosts of the past, whispering their secrets, waiting for justice. She carefully placed the journal back into the leather-lined cavity. Then, one by one, she returned the 5 sacks of diamonds, their heavy, lumpy forms settling back into their nest. She needed time to think, to understand what she had found before making a single move. This was too big, too dangerous. For now, the secret had to remain a secret. She pushed the heavy iron panel shut. It closed with a soft, final thud. Then, with her heart still pounding, she reached for the gear. She turned it back, the metal groaning in protest once more, until she heard another softer click as the lock re-engaged. The faint seam of the door disappeared, blending back into the rust and grime. It was gone. The machine was once again a silent, monolithic beast. But now she knew. She knew the secret that it held in its cold, iron heart. A secret of immense wealth and of terrible, unforgivable crimes. Lucia stood up, her legs stiff and shaky. She looked around the dilapidated mill, but she saw it with entirely new eyes. It was no longer just a symbol of her own failure. It was a place of immense significance, the final resting place of a dark history. The dust motes dancing in the sunbeams seemed to carry whispers. The wind howling through the windows seemed to be calling a name. She felt a profound shift inside her. The desperate, defeated woman who had arrived here was gone, burned away by the discovery. In her place was someone else, someone who held a dangerous and powerful secret. She was no longer just fighting for survival. She was now the unwilling custodian of a 50-year-old mystery, a mystery that involved a fortune in diamonds, a dead man's confession, and a devil who smelled of coal smoke and money. The real danger, she suspected, had only just begun. That night, the mill became a confessional. Lucia lit a single, stubby candle she'd found in her suitcase, the small flame a fragile beacon against the overwhelming darkness. The flickering light cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the stone walls, making the silent machinery seem to breathe. She sat on the cold floor, the journal open in her lap, Michael asleep nearby in their makeshift nest. The air was thick with the scent of melting wax and the dry, ancient smell of the book's pages, a smell of forgotten history. Her hunger was a dull ache, completely overshadowed by a new, sharper sensation, a cold, electric dread that coiled in the pit of her stomach. Her fingers, still grimy from her day's discoveries, trembled as she traced the faded, spidery script. She felt like an intruder reading a soul laid bare, a ghost whispering its darkest secrets directly into her ear. The silence of the world outside was absolute, making the rustle of each turning page sound like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. This book was a testament, and she was its first reader in 50 years. The journal didn't waste time on pleasantries. It plunged directly into a world of fear and shadows, painting a portrait of the man Ansel called the Coal Baron. The entries described a figure of immense and terrible power, a man who moved through the hollows of Appalachia not as a neighbor, but as a predator. "He does not walk, he looms," one entry read. "His shadow falls over this whole valley." The Baron, whose last name Lucia saw with a jolt, was Thorn, was depicted as a man with eyes that saw everything and a voice that never had to be raised to issue a command that felt like a death sentence. He smelled of cigar smoke and the sulphurous scent of his mines, a smell Ansel described as the stench of the earth being torn open and plundered. Lucia could almost feel Ansel's terror seeping from the brittle pages, the palpable fear of a simple man caught in the gears of a powerful, corrupt machine. The Baron wasn't just a man. In Ansel's terrified prose, he was a force of nature, a blight upon the land. The crime itself was laid out in short, stark, horrifying entries. Baron Thorn was running an illegal, off-the-books coal mine on land he had violently and illegally acquired. He used desperate, non-union men, paying them a pittance in cash and working them in treacherous conditions. The journal spoke of cave-ins that were never reported, of men who were simply gone. "2 more men from downriver went to work for him last month," one entry read. "Their wives came asking today. I had to look them in the eye and say, 'I knew nothing. God forgive me. I am a liar and a coward.'" The diamonds, Lucia realized with a wave of nausea, were the lifeblood of this dark enterprise. They were not for the miners. They were payments, bribes to silence officials, and the untraceable currency used to pay for more land, more intimidation, more power. Ansel's words burned into her mind. "He brings them to me covered in coal dust. They are not stones. They are the price of souls. And he has made me his banker." Ansel's own complicity was a thread of agonizing guilt woven through every page. He hadn't been a willing partner. The Baron had leveraged a debt Ansel's father owed, threatening to take the mill and leave him destitute. He had no choice. The mill, with its powerful machinery, was the perfect cover for a secure hiding place, a makeshift safe that no one would ever think to look inside. Ansel was trapped. Forced to be the keeper of Thorn's blood money, Lucia felt a profound and sorrowful empathy for this long-dead man. She could feel his torment, his isolation, the way this secret had eaten him alive from the inside. She ran her hand over the page, the paper dry and fragile under her fingertips, feeling the indentations where his pen had pressed hard in agitation. He was a good man, forced to do a terrible thing, and the journal was his only outlet, the only place he could scream into the void. This book was the weight on his soul, made tangible in leather and paper. The final entries were filled with a frantic, desperate energy. Ansel had learned that Thorn was preparing to close the illegal mine, to erase all traces of its existence, including, Ansel feared, any witnesses. He means to bury it all. The men and their memory, he wrote. In a final act of defiance, Ansel hid the largest shipment of diamonds and wrote down everything he knew, names, dates, locations, crimes in the journal. His plan was clear. He was going to take the journal to the federal authorities in the next state. He was going to risk everything for a chance at redemption. The very last entry was dated October 2nd, 1973. It consisted of 3 words, "Tomorrow, I go." Lucia's heart clenched. He never made it. A massive heart attack, the lawyer's letter had said. It wasn't just a medical event. It was the final tragic silencing of a man who was about to speak. The secret had died with him, right here in this mill, until now. Suddenly, a sound tore through the silence, a low, guttural rumble that grew steadily louder. An engine. Lucia's blood ran cold. Her heart leaped into her throat, hammering against her ribs with a wild, panicked rhythm. No one came here. The driver had said the road was a dead end. The sound was alien and invasive, a mechanical growl that didn't belong in this world of wind and rot. Panic, sharp and blinding, seized her. The journal, the diamonds. Her mind raced. With fumbling, frantic movements, she slammed the journal shut, scrambled over to the great machine, and shoved the book deep into the secret compartment, her knuckles scraping against the cold iron. She couldn't get the gear to lock. There was no time. She just swung the heavy panel shut, praying it would hold, praying it looked undisturbed. She scurried back to her corner, grabbing a ragged blanket and throwing it over the spot where the sacks of diamonds had lain moments before, her breath coming in ragged, silent gasps. A moment later, the entire cavernous space of the mill was flooded with brilliant, blinding light. 2 headlights cut through the gaping windows, sweeping across the decaying interior and painting everything in stark, terrifying relief. The beams caught the thick cobwebs, making them gleam like silver nets, and threw the shadow of the great machine into a monstrous, distorted shape that sprawled across the far wall. Lucia instinctively threw herself in front of Michael, shielding him with her own body as if the light itself were a physical threat. Her every muscle was coiled tight, a steel spring of pure terror. The engine cut out, and the sudden ensuing silence was somehow more menacing than the noise had been. It was a heavy, expectant silence, filled only by the frantic pounding of her own blood in her ears. Then she heard the solid, authoritative thunk of a car door closing, followed by the slow, deliberate crunch of expensive shoes on the gravel outside. A figure appeared in the main doorway, a dark, sharp silhouette against the dying twilight. As he stepped inside, out of the glare, his features resolved themselves. He was a man in his 60s, tall and impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that seemed to absorb the dim light. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, a shocking contrast to the filth and rubble on the floor. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and a thin, cordial smile was fixed on his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were cold, pale, and calculating. They swept across the ruin, taking in the collapsed roof, the dirt floor, and Lucia, huddled in the corner, with a look of undisguised disdain. The air around him seemed to crackle with an aura of power and absolute confidence. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man who owned every room he entered. Lucia felt her throat go dry. She knew, with a certainty that was as absolute as it was terrifying, who this was. "Lucia," he said. His voice was smooth as polished stone, a calm, cultured baritone that carried easily through the vast and cold space. It was not a question, it was a statement. "My name is Thorne, from the law office that contacted you." He made a small, placating gesture with a hand that was clean and manicured. "I apologize for the late hour, but I was in the area and heard you had arrived. I wanted to see for myself that you were settled." The word settled hung in the air, thick with unspoken irony, as his gaze once again swept over the squalor. The false cordiality was a layer of ice over something deep and dangerous. He was testing her, probing. His smile was a mask, and Lucia felt a primal fear that he could see right through her, that he could see the secret she was desperately trying to conceal, that he could smell the lingering scent of the old journal and the cold fire of the diamonds. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. He took another step inside, his polished shoes leaving clean prints in the dust. He gestured vaguely at the colossal, rusted machine in the center of the room. "My father used to tell me stories about this old place, about the miller Ansel, a troubled man, apparently, prone to fantasy." The words were casual, but Lucia felt a cold shock jolt through her. He was talking about the journal. He knew. He didn't know that she knew. But he was laying the groundwork, discrediting the ghost before it could even speak. A chilling realization washed over her. He wasn't just here to see the new heir. He was here to gauge her, to see if she was a threat, to see if 50 years of searching was finally over. He was hunting. The thought made the air feel thin and hard to breathe. Her protective instincts screamed, and she pulled Michael, who was peering out from behind her, even closer, her arm a rigid bar across his chest. Thorne's eyes flickered down to Michael for a brief cold moment before returning to Lucia. The fake smile remained, but it seemed to tighten at the edges. "Look," he said, his tone shifting, becoming more businesslike. "I'll be direct. This place is a death trap. It's a dangerous pile of junk waiting to collapse on your head. It's no place for a woman, let alone a child." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a checkbook. "I am prepared, as an act of charity, you could say, to take this liability off your hands. I'll give you $5,000, cash, more than enough for a bus ticket back to the city and a fresh start." The offer was a calculated insult. $5,000 for a property that held a fortune. It was a test. He was fishing, trying to see if she knew what the land was truly worth. A fierce, protective anger began to burn through Lucia's fear. The condescension, the paltry sum, the dismissal of her as a helpless woman, it all ignited a spark of defiance. Lucia found her voice. It was small, but it didn't tremble. "No," she said, just that. One word. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise, annoyance. It was there and gone in an instant, replaced by that same cold, polished smile. "I see," he said softly. He slowly put the checkbook away, the gesture deliberate and final. "A sentimental woman. I can appreciate that. You want to hold on to your husband's inheritance." He let the word hang in the air, loaded with contempt. He took a step closer, and the air around him felt suddenly frigid. His voice dropped to a near whisper, a sound more menacing than any shout. "But sentimentality can be a dangerous luxury, Lucia. This is a very old place, full of forgotten corners, heavy, unstable machinery." The shift in his tone was terrifying. The mask of the polite lawyer had slipped, revealing the predator beneath. His eyes, cold and devoid of any warmth, drifted from her face and locked onto Michael, who was now hiding completely behind Lucia's legs. Thorne's thin smile widened, becoming something cruel and predatory. "Accidents happen in abandoned places like this," he continued, his voice a silky, venomous thread. "To us, especially with curious children. Boys love to climb, to explore. It would be a tragedy if something fell, or if someone got lost in the woods." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a naked, brutal promise, delivered with the calm assurance of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. He was threatening her son. He was telling her that Michael was the price of her defiance. A wave of pure, cold terror washed over Lucia, so intense it made her feel sick. It was a terror mixed with a white-hot, primal rage she had never felt before. This man had just declared war on her child. He held her gaze for one more long, silent moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. He had delivered his message. Then, with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, he turned and walked out of the mill as calmly as he had entered. Lucia stood frozen, listening to the sound of his footsteps receding, the crunch of gravel sharp and clear in the dead quiet. She heard the car door open and close, the powerful engine turning over with a smooth, expensive roar. The headlights swept across the room one last time, then disappeared, plunging the mill back into near-total darkness. The only light was her single, long, sputtering candle. The silence that rushed back in to fill the void was different now. It was no longer empty. It was charged with a clear and present danger. It was the silence of a hunter's trap that had just been sprung. Lucia sank to the floor, her legs giving way, pulling Michael into a fierce, trembling embrace. The secret she had unearthed was no longer a historical curiosity. It was a weapon pointed directly at her and her son. The journal was a testament. The diamonds were a fortune. But together, they were a death sentence if they fell into the wrong hands. Thorne knew something was here. He didn't know she'd found it, but he would not stop until he had it. He believed the diamonds were his inheritance, the final piece of his father's dark legacy, and he had just made it clear he would remove anyone who stood in his way. She was trapped. If she went to the police with this incredible story, would they even believe her? A destitute widow against the most powerful man in the county, or would she simply be signing her own death warrant? Her mind was a whirlwind of terror and impossible choices. What would you do in her place? Would you run, abandoning the fortune and the chance for justice to save your child, or would you stay and fight, knowing that the man you're fighting holds all the power and is willing to destroy everything you love? The profound silence that followed the roar of Thorne's departing car was more terrifying than any sound. It was a vacuum, heavy and suffocating, that seemed to amplify the frantic hammering of Lucia's own heart. The air, still carrying the faint alien scent of Thorne's expensive cologne, felt poisoned. She remained frozen on the cold stone floor, her arms wrapped around Michael in a grip so tight it must have hurt him. A visceral, animalistic terror had taken root deep inside her, a cold, heavy stone in her gut. The threat had not been idle. It was a promise. She could still see his eyes, pale, reptilian, and utterly devoid of mercy, as he spoke of accidents and curious children. The image was burned into her mind, a brand of pure fear. The crumbling mill was no longer a refuge of last resort. It was a cage, and the predator was now circling, aware of its prey. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe. Every whisper of the wind through the broken roof sounded like a footstep. She was utterly, hopelessly exposed. She pulled Michael even closer, burying her face in his hair, which smelled of dust and the innocent scent of a child. His small body was trembling, a vibration she felt deep in her own bones. He didn't understand the words that had been spoken, but he had understood the tone, the cold menace that had bled through Thorne's polite facade. He had felt the danger, and that was the most damning thing of all. She had led him here, to this ruin, and in doing so, had placed him directly in the path of a monster. The guilt was a physical sickness, a wave of nausea that rose in her throat, hot and acidic. The weight of the diamonds hidden in the machine, the secret of the journal, it all felt like a curse, a treasure that could get them killed. The flickering candlelight cast her shadow, huge and protective, over her son, but she felt incredibly small, a powerless insect caught in a web spun decades before she was born. Her breath hitched in a silent, terrified sob, the sound swallowed by the vast, menacing dark. Hours crawled by, each minute an eternity. Lucia didn't dare move, didn't dare relight the candle after it sputtered and died, plunging them into near total blackness. The faint moonlight that filtered through the gaping holes in the roof was their only illumination, painting the interior in ghostly shades of silver and black. She strained her ears, listening for the sound of Thorne's return. Her entire being coiled into a tight knot of anticipation and dread. The cold from the stone floor was a relentless enemy, seeping through their thin clothes, stealing the warmth from their bodies. Her stomach ached with a hunger she no longer even registered. Her fear was a far more potent and consuming sensation. She thought of the journal, a silent testament of another man's fear in this very spot. She was no longer just a reader of his story. She was living its final, terrifying chapter. The sense of being trapped was absolute, a crushing weight that made it hard to draw a full breath. She was a ghost in a dead man's nightmare. Just as the deepest despair began to settle over her, a new sound reached her ears, faint and hesitant. It wasn't the rumble of an engine. It was a soft, shuffling noise, the sound of slow, careful footsteps on the damp earth outside, followed by a dry, scraping sound on the gravel path. Her heart instantly seized in her chest, a painful, violent jolt of pure panic. They were back. Thorne had sent his men. She clapped a hand over Michael's mouth, who had started to stir, her other hand reaching blindly in the dark for something, anything, to use as a weapon. Her fingers closed around a cold, jagged piece of fallen timber. It was pathetic, but it was something. She held her breath, listening, every nerve screaming. The footsteps stopped directly outside the main doorway. The silence that followed was taut and unbearable. Then, a soft, cracking sound echoed through the mill. It wasn't the sound of a door being forced. It was a gentle, hesitant knock, the sound of old knuckles on rotting wood. The knock came again. 3 soft, questioning taps. It was so contrary to the violence she was expecting that it confused her. A thug wouldn't knock. A predator wouldn't announce itself so politely. Her fear remained, a high-pitched ringing in her ears, but it was now laced with a sliver of bewilderment. A voice followed the knock, thin and reedy with age, carried on the night wind. "Hello, in the mill. I saw the lawyer's car. Just want to make sure you're all right." The voice was not threatening. It was frail, tinged with a genuine-sounding concern. Lucia remained frozen, her mind racing. Was it a trick? Their way to lure her out, but the voice held no malice, only the slightly breathless quality of an old man who had walked a fair distance. She stayed silent, hoping he would go away, but a part of her, a desperate, drowning part, clung to the possibility that this was not another threat, but something else entirely. She was so utterly alone that the mere sound of a human voice that wasn't Thorne's felt like a lifeline. "My name is Jed," the voice continued, closer now, as if the man had stepped just inside the cavernous doorway. "I live just across the creek. Saw you and the boy arrive the other day. Didn't want to bother you." There was a pause, filled only by the sigh of the wind. But Thorne, he ain't the kind of man who pays social calls, not unless he wants something. The man's words hit her with the force of truth. He knew, he understood the danger. This wasn't a trick. This man, Jed, had come because he recognized the wolf that had been at her door. Slowly, painfully, Lucia forced her rigid muscles to relax. She took her hand from Michael's mouth and whispered for him to stay quiet. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she found her own voice, which came out as a hoarse, weak croak. "We're here," she called out, the sound pathetic in the vast emptiness. We're all right." The lie was thin and brittle, and she knew he must have heard the terror still trembling in her voice. The lie was for herself as much as for him. A moment later, a small, bobbing light appeared in the doorway. It was an old-fashioned oil lantern, its warm, yellow glow pushing back the oppressive darkness. It illuminated the man holding it. He was old, perhaps in his late 70s, thin and stooped, with a face that was a roadmap of wrinkles carved by time and hardship. He wore patched overalls and a worn flannel shirt, clothes that seemed as much a part of him as his skin. His hair was a wisp of white, and his hands, gnarled and stained with dirt, held the lantern with a slight tremor. But it was his eyes that held Lucia's attention. They were a pale, faded blue, but they were clear and sharp, and they held no deception. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much, and they were filled with a deep, weary kindness. He smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, a scent as old and honest as the hills around them. He was not a threat. He was a witness. He looked at her and Michael, huddled in the corner, and his weathered face softened with pity. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He shuffled forward, the lantern light preceding him, casting a warm, protective circle around them. He did this. He scared you this bad? He didn't need an answer. He could see it in her wide, terrified eyes, in the way she clutched her son like a shield. Lucia could only manage a slow, stiff nod, the simple movement feeling like a monumental effort. Her throat was tight with unshed tears, but for the first time since Thorne's visit, a tiny fraction of the icy terror inside her began to thaw. The simple presence of this stranger, his quiet empathy, was a balm to her shattered nerves. Jed set the lantern down on a flat-topped stone, and the steady, warm light seemed to push the menacing shadows back into the corners, making the mill feel less like a tomb and more like a simple, dilapidated room. The light itself felt like an act of defiance, a small human warmth against the vast, inhuman cold of the night and her fear. "I saw his fancy car on the road. Figured it was him," Jed said, his voice low and conspiratorial. He hunkered down, his old knees cracking loudly in the silence. He didn't sit too close, giving her space, a gesture of respect she deeply appreciated. Thorne family's been a poison in this valley for 50 years. First the father, now him. They don't just buy land, they devour it, and anyone who gets in their way. His words were a direct confirmation of everything she had read in the journal. This wasn't just in her head. It wasn't a fantasy. It was real. A history known and whispered about by the people who had lived under its shadow. She felt a sudden, urgent need to trust this man, to share the terrible burden she was carrying. The secret was too heavy to hold alone, and it was going to get her and her son killed. She looked at his kind, weary eyes and made a decision. It was another gamble, but her life was already a series of desperate bets. She had to trust someone. "He wants the mill," Lucia whispered, her voice still hoarse. "He offered me money. When I said no, he threatened my son." Just saying the words out loud made them horrifyingly real, and a single tear finally escaped, tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. Jed nodded slowly, his expression grim, unsurprised. That's his way. He finds your weakness and puts his thumb on it until you break. The father was the same, only less polished. He sighed, a long, ragged sound full of old grief. His gaze drifted past her, toward the dark, monstrous shape of the grinding machine. He's been sniffing around this old place for years, ever since Ansel died. Never understood why. It's a ruin. He looked back at her, his pale eyes searching her face, a question forming. But now a lawyer from the city sends an heir he never knew he had. And the day she arrives, Thorne himself shows up with a checkbook and a threat. He ain't looking for real estate, miss. He's looking for something he lost. The dam of Lucia's secrecy broke. The need to confide, to find an ally, overwhelmed the caution that had kept her silent. Her words came out in a rush, a torrent of whispers that filled the quiet space between them. I found it, she breathed, her voice trembling with the enormity of her confession. Inside the machine, there's a secret compartment, a journal, and diamonds, 5 bags of them. She saw Jed's eyes widen, not with greed, but with a sudden dawning comprehension, a look of profound shock and sorrow. It was as if she had just given him the answer to a question he had been asking himself for half a century. He didn't doubt her for a second. He simply stared at her, the lantern light flickering in his wide, astonished eyes, and then he slowly, heavily, bowed his head. A shudder ran through his thin frame. "Ansel," he whispered, the name a breath of grief. "You poor, brave fool, like you really did it." The validation was so absolute, so immediate, that Lucia felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made her dizzy. Jed lifted his head, and Lucia saw that his ancient eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "My brother," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had clearly suppressed for decades. "My younger brother, Daniel. He was one of them. One of the men who went to work for the old Baron in '73 and never came home." The confession hung in the air, a testament to a personal grief that had festered for 50 years. "They told us he ran off, that he'd taken his pay and just left. My mother died believing it. But I knew, we all knew, you didn't just leave a Thorne operation." He looked at Lucia, his gaze intense, connecting his past to her present. "That journal you found, it's not just a story. It's my brother's tombstone. It's the only proof we ever had that he didn't just abandon us. It's the truth we were never allowed to speak." The raw, ancient pain in his voice filled the mill, a sorrow so profound it seemed to make the very stones ache in sympathy. The abstract crimes of the journal now had a face and a name. Daniel. He confirmed everything Ansel had written, his words painting a vivid, horrifying picture of the Thorne family's reign. He spoke of Ansel not as a troubled man prone to fantasy, but as a good, quiet man who was caught in a trap. Ansel was a gentle soul, Jed rasped, his voice filled with a fierce loyalty. He wouldn't hurt a fly, but he was weak, and the old Baron, he knew how to use a man's weakness like a weapon. He tormented Ansel, used him. I saw the fear in his eyes in those last few months. He was a haunted man. Whatever he did, he was forced. He looked at Lucia with a new urgency. "You finding that journal? It's like Ansel is finally speaking from the grave. He's trying to finish what he started." The sense of destiny, of a 50-year-old story demanding its conclusion, was a palpable force in the room. Lucia was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was Ansel's chosen heir, the instrument of his final, desperate act of defiance and justice. "But why now?" Lucia asked, the question that had been tormenting her. "Why is Thorne so desperate all of a sudden?" Jed's face hardened, the weary kindness replaced by a look of bitter disgust. "Politics," he spat, the word tasting like poison. "The final piece of the puzzle, I heard it down at the general store. He's making a run for state senate. He's been pouring money into it, schmoozing, making promises. He wants to be untouchable, a lawmaker. He wants to rewrite the laws that could one day be used against him." The revelation was a lightning strike, illuminating the final, terrifying corner of the conspiracy. The diamonds weren't just for wealth, they were for power, the kind of power that could bury the past so deep it could never be unearthed. "He needs that last shipment his father lost," Jed continued, his voice low and urgent. "He needs to fund the last push of his campaign, and more importantly, he needs to erase the last loose end, the last piece of physical evidence that ties his family's fortune to a string of crimes and a mass grave." The full scale of the danger crashed down on Lucia. This was bigger than a greedy man trying to recover a lost treasure. This was a man on the verge of absolute power, trying to sanitize his history. He was not just a murderer's son. He was an aspiring statesman who would stop at nothing to eliminate the one person and the one piece of evidence that could destroy his future. Her refusal to sell the mill hadn't just been an obstacle. It had been an act of war against his entire life's ambition. He wouldn't just threaten her now. He wouldn't just try to scare her. He would come to finish it. He had no choice. Jed seemed to read the terror on her face. "Son, you can't stay here," he said, his voice firm, decisive. "Not another minute. He'll be back, and he won't be knocking. You and the boy, you come with me. My house is small, but it's hidden. He won't think to look there, not right away. We'll have time to think, to figure out what to do." His offer was a tangible lifeline in a swirling ocean of fear. Lucia didn't hesitate. The trust she felt for this old man was absolute and instinctual. "Yes," she said, her voice clear for the first time. "Yes, just let me get it. The journal." She scrambled over to the machine, her movements clumsy in her haste. She pulled open the loose panel, her heart pounding. Reaching into the dark cavity, her fingers closed around the smooth leather of the journal. The book felt warm, alive with its terrible secrets. Then she paused. The diamonds. She couldn't leave them, but she couldn't carry them all. It was too much, too heavy. It would slow them down. Making a split-second decision, she grabbed one of the heavy canvas sacks, its contents shifting with a dense, promising weight. It was more money than she had ever dreamed of, but it was also evidence. It was proof. She shoved the journal and the single sack into the battered suitcase along with their few clothes, her hands shaking so badly she could barely close the latches. It was a pitiful amount of luggage to contain such an immense and dangerous secret. "Hurry now," Jed urged, his voice a tense whisper. He was standing by the doorway, peering out into the oppressive darkness, his body language screaming of imminent danger. "There's a path through the woods behind the mill. It's quicker, and it stays out of sight of the main road. We have to move now." He was right. The air itself felt charged, humming with a terrible, impending threat. Every second they remained in the mill felt like a second, borrowed from a rapidly dwindling supply. Lucia grabbed Michael's hand, his small fingers cold and limp in hers, and hoisted the surprisingly heavy suitcase. Michael was dazed with sleep and fear, stumbling beside her as she rushed toward the back of the mill. Jed led the way, his lantern cutting a nervous, dancing path through the darkness. He pointed to a large, gaping hole in the rear stone wall, where the structure had long since collapsed. "Through here. Watch your step. The ground is uneven." The opening was a black moor, a gateway into the unknown darkness of the Appalachian night. As Lucia helped Michael scramble over the rubble and through the opening, a new sound ripped through the night, a sound that froze the blood in her veins. It was the angry, guttural roar of a heavy-duty truck, its engine straining as it tore down the gravel road, far faster and more recklessly than Thorne's luxury car had. The sound was brutal, aggressive, and utterly without stealth. Two beams of light, higher and wider than before, sliced through the trees, illuminating the front of the mill. The truck screeched to a halt, the sound of protesting tires and gravel spraying like shrapnel. Doors were thrown open, heavy, angry sounds that slammed against the silence. Then came the voices. They were not calm and cultured like Thorne's. They were rough, guttural, and laced with a casual brutality. "You take the front. I'll check the sides," one voice barked. "He wants it found tonight, and he wants... I'm scared." They weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming to destroy. "Run!" Jed hissed, his voice a sharp crack of command. He grabbed Lucia's arm, pulling her forward. "Don't look back. Just run!" Panic, pure and undiluted, propelled her forward. She half-dragged, half-carried Michael as she plunged into the darkness of the woods behind Jed. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of slick, damp leaves and gnarled roots that seemed to grab at her ankles. The air was frigid, burning her lungs as she gasped for breath. Behind them, a terrible sound echoed from the mill, the sharp, percussive crack of a sledgehammer hitting stone, followed by the high-pitched, musical shattering of glass, the last intact window pane. The sound was one of pure, mindless violence, an act of rage against the silent building. They were tearing it apart, looking for the secret, looking for them. Her heart felt like it was going to explode in her chest. a wild, frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. They ran blindly, stumbling through the undergrowth, the darkness of the woods almost absolute. Jed's lantern, which he had shielded, was their only guide, a tiny, frantic spark in a vast sea of black. The sounds from the mill grew louder, a symphony of destruction. A deep, resonant boom echoed through the trees as a sledgehammer found the cast-iron body of the great grinding machine. Lucia flinched at the sound, a violation that felt almost personal. It was the sound of her secret being brutally hunted. Branches whipped at her face, leaving stinging scratches on her cheeks. A sharp root caught her foot, and she went down hard, the suitcase flying from her hand, her body slamming into the cold, damp earth. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs. For a second, she lay there, gasping, a fresh wave of terror washing over her. She had to get up. She had to keep moving. Michael was crying now, soft, terrified sobs that cut her to the core. Jed was there in an instant, his old, gnarled hand grabbing her arm, pulling her to her feet with surprising strength. "Get up, child, get up! We're almost there!" he urged, his voice a ragged whisper. He retrieved the suitcase, shoving it back into her hand. The sounds of destruction from the mill continued, a relentless, brutal percussion that spurred them on. They were a soundtrack to her terror. Another sound joined the cacophony, a splintering crash, the sound of a massive wooden beam giving way, followed by a triumphant, ugly laugh that carried unnervingly clearly on the night air. The thugs were enjoying their work. Lucia scrambled to her feet, her body screaming in protest, and pushed onward, fueled by a surge of pure adrenaline. She could feel the men's presence behind her, a palpable wave of violence that seemed to chase them through the trees. They were no longer just running from a threat. They were being actively hunted, and the forest was their only shield. She could hear something new now, a strange, low crackling sound, like 1,000 dry twigs snapping at once. It was getting louder, building beneath the rhythmic smashing of the hammers, and a new smell reached her, sharp and acrid, on the cold night air. The smell of smoke, a thick, resinous smell of old, dry wood catching fire. Her blood ran cold. They weren't just searching the mill, they were destroying it, erasing any evidence that might have been left behind, any fingerprints, any trace of their presence or hers. They were salting the earth, ensuring that whatever secrets the mill held, besides the one they were looking for, would be turned to ash and smoke. The thought was horrifying. Ansel's tomb, his final testament, was being immolated, its history burned away by the very evil it was meant to expose. The act was one of such profound and arrogant malice that it took her breath away. They were not just criminals, they were erasers of history. They broke through the tree line into a small clearing. Ahead of them, nestled against a small rise, was a tiny, dark shape. Jed's house, a small cabin that looked almost like a part of the landscape itself. A plume of smoke curled lazily from its stone chimney. It was a haven, a promise of safety just 100 yards away. They were so close. Spurred by the sight, Lucia found a new burst of strength, her legs pumping, her lungs burning, pulling Michael along with her. The crackling sound from behind them was a roar now, and the night sky in the direction of the mill was no longer black. It was glowing with a malevolent, dancing orange light that pulsed like a giant, angry heart. The glow silhouetted the tops of the trees, casting long, writhing shadows that seemed to claw at them as they ran. The heat was a phantom presence, a wave she could feel even from this distance, carrying the thick, choking smell of burning history. As they reached the relative safety of the clearing, just feet from Jed's porch, Lucia risked a glance over her shoulder. The sight stole the air from her lungs and made her stop dead in her tracks. The mill was no longer a building. It was a funeral pyre. Flames, brilliant and terrifying, erupted from the gaping hole in the roof, licking at the night sky like monstrous, hungry tongues. The entire structure was engulfed, a skeleton of stone and timber wreathed in a shroud of fire. The great machine, the keeper of secrets, was at the heart of the inferno, its iron frame glowing a dull, angry red. It was a scene of apocalyptic destruction, a beautiful and horrifying spectacle. This was Thorne's final answer to her defiance. It was a message, written in fire and smoke, declaring that he would burn the whole world down to protect his secrets and reclaim what he believed was his. The desperate hope she had carried to this place was now a column of black smoke rising into the unforgiving Appalachian sky. The roar of the fire was a living thing, a hungry beast devouring the last remnants of Ansel's life, of Roberto's phantom inheritance, of her own foolish, desperate gamble. She could feel the intense heat on her face, even from across the creek bed. Sparks, like angry fireflies, spiraled up into the darkness, a constellation of dying embers. The destruction was absolute, methodical, and complete. They hadn't just come to scare her, they had come to erase her, to burn her out of the story, to ensure that if they couldn't find the secret, no one ever would. In that moment, watching the flames consume the mill, Lucia understood the full, terrifying nature of the man she was up against. He would not be reasoned with, he would not be deterred. He was a force of pure, destructive will. She clutched the suitcase to her chest, the hard shape of the journal and the lumpy weight of the diamonds a stark, hidden reality against the blazing inferno of the visible world. The fire was an ending, but the secret in her hands was a new beginning, a beginning of a war. A wave of dizziness and nausea washed over her. The smoke, the running, the sheer, unrelenting terror of the last few hours culminated in a physical revolt. She stumbled against Jed's porch railing, her knuckles white as she gripped the rough wood to keep from collapsing. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the roaring flames blurring into a smear of orange and yellow. She was alive. Michael was safe. She had the journal. She had proof. But she was a hunted fugitive with a 10-year-old child, her last refuge a pillar of fire behind her, and her only ally a frail old man. The victory felt terrifyingly hollow, a desperate gasp of air before being plunged back under the waves. The image of the burning mill, the final violent punctuation mark to Thorne's threat, was seared into her memory, a permanent brand on her soul. She was no longer just a widow fighting poverty. She was a witness who had seen the enemy's face, and she knew, with chilling certainty, that he would never stop hunting her. "Get inside." Jed's voice was a firm, grounding presence in the chaos of her senses. He was already unlocking his door, pushing it open into a dark, warm-smelling interior. "They'll see the glow for miles, but they won't come this way. They think you're in there." He gestured with his head back towards the blazing mill. The thought was horrifying, that the thugs and Thorne believed she and Michael were being consumed by the flames they had set. They had intended to commit murder. The realization landed with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a scare tactic that had gone wrong. This was the plan, to find the diamonds and leave no witnesses. Just an unfortunate, tragic accident. A desperate widow and her son, trapped in a fire in a derelict building. A neat, clean, and utterly brutal solution. Her stomach churned, and she fought back the bile that rose in her throat. The game had changed. They were no longer just chasing her, they thought they had already won. She staggered into the small cabin, pulling Michael with her. Jed shut the door behind them, plunging them into a comforting, absolute darkness. The air inside was warm and smelled of old books, pipe tobacco, and something savory, like leftover stew. It was the smell of a life, of a home. After the cold, decaying emptiness of the mill, it was the most welcoming scent in the world. Jed fumbled for a moment before a match scraped, and the soft, gentle light of another oil lamp filled the small, single room. It was a simple space, crammed with books, carved wooden figures, and worn, comfortable-looking furniture. It was the den of a man who lived with his memories. In the face of the raging inferno outside, this small, quiet room felt like a sanctuary, a tiny pocket of sanity in a world that had gone completely mad. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Lucia felt the crushing weight on her chest lift. Just a fraction. They were safe. For now. She sank into a worn armchair, her body finally surrendering to the bone-deep exhaustion. The heavy suitcase dropped to the floor beside her with a soft thud. Michael, his face streaked with tears and dirt, immediately crawled into her lap, burying his face against her chest, his small body still trembling. She wrapped her arms around him, her own tremors finally beginning to subside. She could still hear the distant roar of the fire, a constant, low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, a reminder of the violence they had just escaped. But here, in the warm lamplight of Jed's home, surrounded by the quiet evidence of a long and thoughtful life, the terror began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard, and unfamiliar feeling. It was anger, a deep, crystalline rage. Thorn had tried to murder her son. He had tried to burn them alive. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in control. This was no longer just about survival. This was about justice. Jed moved about the small cabin with a quiet efficiency. He bolted the door, then covered the single window with a thick, heavy blanket, plunging the room into an even deeper, more intimate isolation. The only sound besides the distant fire was the gentle hiss of the lamp and Michael's soft, hitching breaths as he slowly cried himself to sleep in Lucia's arms. Jed brought her a tin cup filled with cool water from a bucket, and she drank it greedily, the simple act feeling like a profound luxury. He didn't speak, giving her the silence she needed to process the horror. He understood. He had lived a lifetime adjacent to this violence, and his quiet, calm, steady presence was more comforting than any words could have been. He was a rock, an anchor in the storm, and Lucia clung to his silent strength as she tried to piece together her shattered reality. The world had been reduced to this single or warm room, a fortress against the burning night outside. As Michael's breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of exhausted sleep, Lucia looked at Jed. His face, illuminated by the lamplight, was a mask of grim determination. The old weary kindness was still there, but it was overlaid with something harder, something forged in the fire of this night. He was no longer just a sympathetic neighbor. He was a co-conspirator, an ally in a war he had been waiting 50 years to fight. He met her gaze, and a silent understanding passed between them. They were the last two people who knew the truth. They held the story of Ansel, of Daniel, of all the forgotten men whose lives had been crushed by the Thorn family's ambition. The journal, safe in the suitcase at her feet, was their only weapon. Outside, the fire raged, an act of erasure meant to silence the past forever. But inside this small cabin, in the quiet resolve of a desperate mother and a grieving brother, the past was refusing to burn. It was getting ready to fight back. The roar of the fire was a constant, rumbling bass note that vibrated through the floorboards of Jed's cabin, a terrifying reminder of the hell they had just escaped. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning history. Jed, his face a grim mask in the flickering lamplight, spoke in a low, urgent whisper. "My phone's a party line. Thorn's got ears everywhere in this county. It ain't safe." He explained his plan, his voice a dry rasp. He had a cousin in the next county over, a 2-hour drive away. Years ago, after his first failed attempt to get justice for Daniel, he had kept the name of a young FBI agent in the public corruption unit, a man named Harris who had believed him but had no proof. "That journal," Jed said, his gaze intense, "it's the proof he always needed." It's Ansel's voice from the grave. Lucia, holding a sleeping Michael, felt a cold, hard resolve crystallize in her chest. The fear was still there, a coiling serpent in her gut, but it was now overlaid with a diamond-hard layer of pure, unadulterated rage. They had tried to murder her son. The journey began in the deepest hour of the night, under a moonless, star-dusted sky. Jed's old truck rattled and groaned in protest, its engine a noisy accomplice in their desperate flight. The headlights cut a weak yellow swathe through the oppressive darkness of the winding mountain roads. Lucia sat rigidly in the passenger seat, the cold, cracked vinyl a stark contrast to the burning anger inside her. She clutched the battered suitcase on her lap, the hard, rectangular shape of the journal a constant, solid reminder of her purpose. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow that danced at the edge of their lights, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her veins. She felt hunted, exposed, a fugitive carrying a truth so explosive it had set the world on fire. The glow of the burning mill slowly receded in the rearview mirror, a dying orange ember of her past life, and with every mile that put it behind them, her transformation from victim to avenger felt more complete, more irrevocable. They arrived at a small sleeping farmhouse as the first hint of grey lightened the eastern sky. Jed's cousin, a tired-looking woman who asked no questions, led them to a phone in a quiet kitchen that smelled of old wood and yeast. Jed's gnarled hand trembled as he dialed the number from a faded scrap of paper. His voice, when he spoke, was thick with 50 years of grief and hope. "Agent Harris, it's Jedediah Miller, from Black Creek. About my brother. I have it. I have the proof." There was a pause. Then Jed handed the phone to Lucia. Her own voice, when she spoke, was not the trembling whisper of a terrified victim. It was the clear, steady voice of a witness. She recounted everything: the discovery, the journal's contents, Thorne's threat, the fire. She described the sack of raw diamonds she had with her. The silence on the other end was absolute, followed by a voice that was no longer sympathetic, but sharp, focused, and galvanized. "Mummy, where are you? Don't move. Do not talk to anyone else. We're coming." The wait was an eternity spent in a state of suspended animation. Then they came. Not the single cruiser of a local sheriff, but 3 black, nondescript sedans that rolled up the gravel driveway with quiet, lethal efficiency. Men in dark, professional suits emerged, their movements calm, their faces serious. The lead agent, Harris, was a man in his 50s with eyes that missed nothing. He listened as Lucia, her voice never wavering, gave her official statement. She then opened the suitcase. She handed him the leather-bound journal. He received it not like evidence, but like a sacred text, his fingers tracing the brittle cover with a kind of reverence. When she opened the small canvas sack, spilling a handful of the dull, greasy stones onto the kitchen table, a low whistle escaped another agent's lips. This was it, the tangible, undeniable heart of a 50-year-old crime. Lucia felt a profound shift in the universe. The power had finally, decisively, changed hands. The ghosts of the valley finally had an army. Justice, when it came, was a whirlwind. Armed with search warrants fueled by the journal's damningly specific entries and Lucia's sworn testimony, the federal convoy swept back into Black Creek as the sun rose. The raid on the Thorne estate was swift and methodical. The gates that were designed to keep the world out were breached without ceremony. Mr. Thorne, the untouchable baron, the aspiring statesman, was apprehended in his silk bathrobe on the marble steps of his mansion, the smooth, cultured mask shattered, revealing a face contorted with pure, sputtering rage and disbelief. He who had moved through the world with the calm assurance of a god was now powerless, his wrists bound by cold steel. His 2 thugs, found sleeping off their night of destruction, were rounded up with brutal simplicity. The news spread through the valley like wildfire, a seismic shockwave that toppled a half-century of fear. The devil who smelled of coal smoke and money had finally been chained. The journal was not done giving up its secrets. On one of the last pages, Ansel, in a fit of desperate foresight, had drawn a crude but detailed map of the Baron's land, marking a specific isolated grove of birch trees with a simple, chilling X. Guided by this map from a dead man's hand, FBI agents and forensic teams converged on the spot. The air was heavy and somber, the only sounds the whir of equipment and the low murmur of professional voices. The scrape of shovels on earth was a sound of exhumation, of truth being unearthed. First, they found a rusted belt buckle, then the remains of a work boot, and then the bones. A mass grave, just as Ansel's tormented script had described. Jed stood at the edge of the police tape, a solitary, rigid figure against the morning sky, watching as the remains of his brother Daniel and the other lost men of the valley were finally, gently, brought out of the dark earth and into the light of a day they had been denied for 50 years. The legal fallout was a slow-moving earthquake that dismantled the entire Thorne empire. The journal provided a roadmap for prosecutors, connecting the diamonds to international money laundering schemes and the illegal mine to a string of disappearances and corporate crimes. Thorne's assets, a fortune built on a foundation of blood and coal dust, were seized by the federal government. Months later, in a quiet courtroom, a judge addressed Lucia. In recognition of her courage and for her role as the sole heir to the crime's first victim, Ansel, the court awarded her a substantial portion of the confiscated assets as restitution. She stared at the number on the legal document, a figure so vast and astronomical it seemed like a misprint. It was a stark, dizzying contrast to the $50 she'd clutched in her hand in that cold apartment. The burned-out mill and its land were legally deeded to her, no longer a tomb of false hope, but a monument to a battle she had won. A year later, the silence in Lucia's home was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the oppressive, defeated quiet of her old apartment. It was a peaceful, sun-drenched silence, broken only by the happy, rhythmic whir of a brand-new, top-of-the-line sewing machine. Her new house was bright and airy, and the air didn't smell of mold and despair, but of lemon polish and the faint, delicious scent of baking bread from her kitchen. She was in her own dedicated sewing room, surrounded by bolts of colorful silk and cotton, working on a dress for a client. The steady hum of the machine was the sound of her independence, the soundtrack to her new life. Her hands, once scraped and raw from cleaning a ruin, were now deft and creative, guiding fabric with the confident artistry she had almost lost. She was no longer just surviving. She was creating beauty, building a business, and authoring her own future, one perfect stitch at a time. The hollow ache of hunger was a distant, faded memory. Michael sat at a large, polished oak table, not staring at a sparse plate, but hunched over a history textbook, a half-eaten apple, and a tall glass of milk by his side. He laughed, a full-mass unrestrained sound, at something he read. The sound was the sweetest music Lucia had ever heard. It was the sound of a childhood reclaimed, of a future unburdened by fear and poverty. She looked at him, and the familiar clench in her heart was no longer pain, but a wave of love so profound and peaceful it felt like a prayer. He had his own room, a shelf full of books, and the best teachers in the county. The thin, haunted look was gone from his face, replaced by the healthy, curious expression of a boy who knew he was safe, who knew he was loved. She had not only saved him from a fire, she had delivered him into a life of limitless possibility, a life purchased with her own impossible courage. The nightmare was truly finally over. This was their redemption. Lucia's story is a testament to the extraordinary strength that can be found in the deepest wells of despair. She walked into a ruin expecting a roof over her head, and instead found the forgotten ghosts of a great injustice, and in doing so, found her own unshakable power. She proved that one voice, armed with the truth, can indeed topple an empire of lies. Stories like hers, of incredible resilience and the fight for justice against impossible odds, are a powerful reminder of the strength hidden within us all. If you were moved by Lucia's journey from the edge of surrender to the heart of the fight, and you want to hear more tales of survival, mystery, and redemption, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Please ring the notification bell so you never miss another story that proves the human spirit is the most unbreakable force in the world.